In 1594, the Spanish colonial authorities sealed forever one of the most disturbing files in all of New Spain: 47 indigenous uprisings that ended in perfectly calculated massacres. That mathematical precision was no coincidence. For 47 years, the Montesinos family had turned their school of preachers into a factory of horror, transforming indigenous leaders into willing executioners of their own people. What you're about to discover are the methods that the authorities decided to bury forever. Before we continue with what really happened inside the School of Preachers of Oaxaca, make sure you're subscribed and tell us in the comments what country or city you're listening from. Do you dare to discover how one family managed to turn genocide into an act of faith? Now, let me take you back to the days when this story began, a story that will forever change the way you see the colonial past. It was the year 1547. The city of Oaxaca was a boiling cauldron of colonial tension. Only 25 years had passed since the final conquest of the Zapotec region, and New Spain was still struggling to secure its control over indigenous populations who still remembered freedom. Among the hills that surrounded the city, entire communities continued to preserve their ancestral traditions while pretending to accept the Catholic faith, creating a fragile balance that could break at any moment. It was in this explosive context that Father Antonio Montesinos, a master from Salamanca, arrived accompanied by his two sons. Friar Bartolomé Montesinos, a 28-year-old rhetorical preacher, and Diego Montesinos, a 19-year-old seminarian. The family had obtained from Viceroy Luis de Velasco a rare authorization to establish the School of Preachers of Oaxaca, an institution that promised to train missionaries specialized in the ultimate conversion of indigenous peoples. The school was set up in an abandoned convent on the outskirts of the city, a volcanic stone building with thick walls, once inhabited by Franciscans before a smallpox epidemic wiped out the entire community. Locals avoided the place, whispering that the souls of the dead friars still roamed its corridors. For the Montesinos family, this was not an inconvenience. It was an advantage. They needed absolute privacy to develop their methods. Antonio Montesinos was a broad-shouldered man with cold gray eyes that seemed to constantly evaluate whoever stood before him. He had studied rhetoric in Salamanca and theology in Paris, but his true specialization was something he called applied pastoral psychology. During his years in Europe, he had observed how different preaching techniques could alter the behavior of crowds, from provoking religious ecstasy to inciting peasant revolts. His son Bartolomé had inherited not only his father's intellect, but also a morbid fascination with the limits of human manipulation. He was a born orator, capable of making an audience weep with a parable or rage with an apocalyptic sermon. His dark eyes and deep voice gave him a hypnotic charisma, perfected through years of practice. The younger brother, Diego, was different, physically fragile, but mentally brilliant. He possessed an extraordinary memory and a meticulous eye for detail, which made him the perfect recorder of data. While his father and brother preached, Diego noted down every reaction, every gesture, every word that triggered a specific emotional response. The School of Preachers officially opened its doors 3 times a week to young Creoles and mestizos who wished to become missionaries. But the real students arrived on nights of the new moon, when covered carriages delivered to the convent selected indigenous leaders from remote communities. These men believed they were being given advanced Christian education, something that would grant them influence and power among their people. The Montesinos' first experimental lesson took place in the early hours of March 15, 1548. They had carefully selected their test subject, Isel Cosagiza, a young Zapotec leader from the community of Mitla. He was both exceptionally intelligent and deeply resistant to traditional evangelization methods. Cosagiza arrived at the convent convinced he was to take part in a special Christian initiation ceremony that would grant him spiritual authority over his people. What he found was something completely different. Antonio Montesinos welcomed him into a side chapel lit only by black candles arranged in geometric patterns that cast dancing shadows along the stone walls. The technique they used that night had been developed by Antonio over years of obsessive study. It began with sensory deprivation. Kosajiza was blindfolded and locked inside a silent cell for 48 hours, receiving only water and small portions of bread mixed with herbs that subtly altered perception. These plants, known among local healers as the tears of Quetzalcoatl, produced a state of hypervigilance and suggestibility without causing hallucinations. When he was finally brought before Bartolomé Montesinos, Kosajiza's mind was dangerously vulnerable. The friar began what he called theological inversion. He used Christian concepts to awaken guilt and fear, but subtly intertwined them with elements of Zapotec cosmology that he and his family had studied in detail. Your people suffer because you have failed as their spiritual guide. Bartolomé began, his voice calm and hypnotic. The ancient gods of your blood are enraged because you accepted the cross without true sacrifice. Christ demands that you prove your faith in the only way that both he and your ancestors can understand. For 6 consecutive hours, Bartolomé wove a complex narrative, presenting violent rebellion against the colonial authorities not as a political act, but as a divine obligation for the salvation of his community. He quoted real biblical verses, but twisted their meaning so that they seemed to command the exact opposite of what they truly said. Hidden behind a curtain, Diego Montesinos recorded everything, every word, every pause, every shift in Kosajiza's breathing. He had developed his own coded system of notation that allowed him to document not only what was said, but how it was said and what emotional effect it produced. The crucial moment came when Bartolomé showed Kosajiza a forged document, supposedly a letter from Viceroy Luis de Velasco himself, describing secret plans to exterminate the entire Zapotec population within 6 months. The document, created with authentic inks and official seals, appeared completely real. Only an immediate uprising can save your people, Bartolomé whispered. But it must be carried out exactly as I instruct you, following the signs that God has revealed to me in visions. Any deviation from the divine plan will condemn all who follow you to eternal damnation. What Kosajiza didn't know was that the Montesinos family had already prepared every detail of his holy rebellion. They had mapped out exactly which colonial officials were to be attacked, when the uprising would occur, and how the royal forces would respond. Even more chilling, they had secretly arranged for the authorities to be waiting for the attack. 3 days later, Kosajiza returned to Mitla carrying not only the detailed plan of revolt, but also the unshakable conviction that the violence he was about to unleash was the direct will of God. The Montesinos family had achieved what no manipulator before them had ever done. They had turned an indigenous leader into a conscious, willing instrument of his own people's destruction. The Mitla uprising began exactly as the Montesinos had predicted. At dawn on April 3, 1548, Kosajiza led 347 Zapotec warriors in a coordinated assault on the nearest colonial military post. He followed the instructions to the letter, attacking from the north flank, using flaming arrows against the thatched roofs, and retreating into the valley precisely 1 hour after the fighting began. What he didn't know was that Captain Hernando de Soto had been informed a week in advance of every detail, not just the time and place, but even the rebels' escape routes. When the Zapotecs retreated, they walked directly into a perfectly prepared ambush. The massacre that followed was documented meticulously by Diego Montesinos, who observed it from a nearby hill through a telescope. His notes, written in the family's private code, recorded not only the number of deaths, but also the reaction times, troop formations, and the effectiveness of each extermination tactic. Hour 14:30. Pincer formation executed according to prediction A7. Indigenous resistance collapsed in 23 minutes. Panic induction effectiveness, 89%. Survivors, 12 out of 347. Subject Kosajiza eliminated at minute 8 according to Plan B3. He wrote it with such clinical detachment that it froze the blood. But the most disturbing part of the experiment wasn't the massacre itself. It was what had happened before it. The Montesinos had sent secret observers to Mitla to record how Kosajiza convinced his people to join what would become their own annihilation. The transcripts of those reports revealed the diabolical genius of the Montesinos method. Kosajiza hadn't lied to his people. He truly believed he was fulfilling a divine mission. With absolute conviction, he told the Zapotec warriors that their glorious deaths in battle would guarantee eternal salvation for their entire community, including the women and children who would remain behind. Mitla had accepted the collective sacrifice not out of despair or fanaticism, but out of genuine faith. The Montesinos had managed to turn genocide into an act of voluntary religious devotion. 3 weeks after the massacre, Antonio Montesinos wrote in his private journal, "The Mitla experiment confirms our initial hypotheses. Indigenous resistance can be neutralized not by brute force, but by redirecting their own spirituality towards self-destructive ends." The subject not only accepts his elimination, he embraces it as a sacred duty. News of the Zapotec uprising rippled through New Spain as a grim warning. Proof, officials said, of the need for constant vigilance against unpacified indigenous populations. The viceroyal authorities discreetly congratulated the Montesinos for what they believed was preventive intelligence work, never suspecting the rebellion had been utterly fabricated. But for the family of manipulators, Mitla was only a first step in a far more ambitious experiment. Antonio had devised what he called the equation of voluntary self-destruction, a mathematical formula that predicted precisely what combination of sensory deprivation, theological inversion, and forged documentation would turn any indigenous leader into the willing executioner of his own people. Do you feel the diabolical complexity? This is not a standard story of colonial conquest. It is something far more sinister. If this account sends a chill down your spine, like the video and share it with someone who loves the darkest corners of history. Few channels dare to tell these truths, and we need your support to continue unearthing secrets that were buried for centuries. Over the following 5 years, the school of preachers became an industrial engine of tragedy. The Montesinos refined their techniques through systematic variations that Diego recorded in what he called the manuscript of human variables. Each new indigenous student arriving on new moon nights represented an opportunity to test a different element of the equation. Some endured longer periods of sensory deprivation. With others, the tears of Quetzalcoatl were mixed with psychoactive mushrooms or fever-inducing herbs. Bartolome developed 3 distinct protocols of theological inversion, each tailored to a specific psychological profile. The martyr protocol targeted mystically inclined leaders, convincing them their violent death would open the gates of Christian paradise for their entire community. The warrior protocol targeted natural military leaders, framing the suicidal uprising as the only path to reclaim lost ancestral honor. The most disturbing, the sacrificial protocol, targeted religiously grounded leaders, persuading them that their ancestral gods demanded the sacrifice of the entire tribe as penance for generations of apostasy. But it was Diego who made the most chilling discovery. While analyzing the results of the first 15 experiments, he detected predictable patterns in the post-manipulation behavior that neither his father nor brother had foreseen. The manipulated leaders did not return home simply to carry out suicidal rebellions. They acquired an almost supernatural persuasive power that enabled them to convince entire populations to embrace their own destruction. Diego documented a staggering statistic in his ciphered notes. Post-procedure leaders showed a 340% increase in social influence. A single process leader could directly influence up to 500 people, Each of those could then influence dozens more. The potential for devastation was geometric. Antonio reached a horrified fascination at this discovery. They had not merely perfected a manipulation technique. They had, inadvertently, created human vectors for a psychological contagion capable of transmitting self-destructive behaviors across communities by mechanisms the family did not yet fully understand. The most unnerving case involved Xochitl Nezahualcóyotl, a healer and spiritual leader of the Nahua community in Tlaxiaco. Subjected to the sacrificial protocol in the summer of 1552, Xochitl returned with a mission she described as the final purification of her chosen people. Diego had succeeded in placing an embedded observer in Tlaxiaco, a mestizo salt trader named Rodrigo Vasquez. Rodrigo's weekly reports described a process of collective persuasion that defied logic. Xochitl did not coerce or threaten. She spoke with such absolute conviction that listeners began to experience dreams and visions confirming her message. She has convinced 800 people that they must die to save their children from eternal damnation, Rodrigo wrote in his final dispatch. There is no resistance because there is no perceived deception. Every adult has had identical dreams where their ancestors confirmed the necessity of the sacrifice. The final purification of Tlaxiaco occurred at the autumnal equinox of 1552. 800 people, among them 200 children, walked willingly into a prepared military ambush under the command of Captain Diego de Mazariegos. But unlike earlier uprisings, there was no battle. The population assembled in ceremonial formation and waited passively to be killed, singing hymns that mixed Christian prayers with indigenous chants. The captain, a veteran of many campaigns, recorded in official reports, "I have never seen anything so unnatural. They were not executed as enemies, but as willing sacrifices. Some smiled as they died. My own soldiers were traumatized by what was technically a complete military victory." By 1558, the Montesinos had refined their system into a precise science. Diego's manuscript of human variables swelled to 847 pages detailing not only manipulation methods, but the dissemination patterns of the resulting psychological contagion. They identified primary susceptibility types, psychological profiles of leaders who would predictably respond to specific protocols, and, more disturbingly, developed techniques to identify these types through remote observation alone. Diego had created a network of indirect observers operating in markets, religious festivals, and communal gatherings across the region. These agents, ostensibly performing routine surveillance for the Holy Office, were in fact collecting detailed psychological data on potential community leaders. The Montesinos then introduced what they called the Cascade Protocol, the mechanism that turned their operation into something truly monstrous. Antonio theorized that if they could manipulate multiple interconnected leaders simultaneously, the contagion effect would amplify exponentially and create waves of self-destruction far beyond the initial targets. The Cascade Protocol's trial began in January 1559 with the selection of 7 Mixtec leaders who maintained trade and kinship ties among their communities. Over 6 months, the Montesinos processed these leaders at precisely calculated intervals, adjusting theological messages so they complemented each other without being identical. Each leader received revelations tailored to their community that, when combined, formed a complex multi-village theological imperative. Diego predicted that the cascade would manifest once the manipulated leaders began communicating with one another to coordinate the divine will. What he had not anticipated was the speed and intensity with which this occurred. Within 3 weeks, the 7 Mixtec communities had formed an informal theocratic council operating via constant messengers. These messengers did not carry military orders, but revelations, sacred confirmations that matched and reinforced the visions each leader had received. Diego's reports grew alarmed. They have developed synchronization beyond conscious coordination. They conduct rituals simultaneously without prior communication. The leaders share identical dreams on the same nights. It is as if they are controlled by a collective mind. Worse still, the cascade began to spread beyond the initial 7. Traders, relatives, and visitors who spent time in these communities started reporting similar dreams and visions. Some returned to their own villages carrying fragments of the contagion that began manifesting in unpredictable ways. Antonio, for the first time in 11 years of experimentation, realized they might have created something beyond their control. "We have opened a door perhaps we cannot close," he wrote. "The contagion's patterns exceed our models. We may have discovered forces of human nature we do not fully comprehend. If this account chills you, share it with a friend who loves mysteries. Like the video to support this content and subscribe so you won't miss what we uncover next. You'll be part of a select group that knows these forbidden secrets." The final explosion of the Montesinos experiment began in a way no one could have foreseen. In the early hours of September 23, 1559, Rodrigo Vasquez sent what would become his last report. Situation out of control. The 7 communities have begun a mass migration toward an unknown location. No response to interceptors. Estimated total population, 4,300, including children. Requesting immediate instructions. Diego rode through the night to reach the point from which Vasquez had sent his message, but found only the cold ashes of a campfire and signs of a hurried departure. The entire Mixtec population had abandoned their towns, taking only what they could carry and destroying everything else. It was as if 4,300 people had decided, simultaneously, to erase every trace of their previous existence. For 3 days, Diego followed scattered trails through the Sierra Madre Mountains, finding increasingly disturbing clues. The migrants had abandoned tools, food, even small children unable to walk long distances. These children were found in caves, carefully arranged in groups with enough provisions for several days, as if their parents planned to return for them after completing some urgent task. On September 27th, Diego finally located the migrating multitude in a remote valley near the border with Puebla. What he saw from a rocky ridge would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. The 4,300 people had arranged themselves into a perfect geometric formation, covering nearly 2 square kilometers of the valley floor. It was not a chaotic refugee camp, but a ceremonial design, where each family occupied a precise position according to criteria Diego could not decipher. At the very center of the formation stood a temporary structure combining Christian and pre-Hispanic architectural elements, a giant wooden cross rising from the base of a stepped stone pyramid built from local rock. Even more astonishing, the entire structure had been completed in less than 4 days by people with no tools or plans. Through his telescope, Diego observed that the population was engaged in continuous ritual preparation. Adults fasted while performing synchronized dance movements for hours. Teenagers had shaved their heads and painted geometric symbols across their bare bodies. The children who remained sat in silent meditation, motionless for extraordinary lengths of time. Then Diego managed to get close enough to hear their chanting, and realized the full magnitude of the horror his family had unleashed. They were not singing in Mixtec, Nahuatl, or Spanish. They had developed an entirely new language, one that blended all three but followed phonetic patterns belonging to none. When Diego transcribed portions of the chants and compared them to his earlier notes, he discovered something impossible. The verses contained exact fragments of the theological manipulations his brother Bartolome had once used on the original 7 leaders. It was as if the entire population had directly accessed the mental control techniques that had been applied only to those few men. The revelation became undeniable when Diego intercepted one of the couriers the communities sent periodically to collect the abandoned children from the caves. Under interrogation, the messenger calmly revealed a truth that froze Diego's blood. "We have not migrated to hide or build anew," the man said. "We came here to carry out the final offering." The leaders received a revelation that our individual sacrifices were not enough. To ensure the salvation of all souls of the region, we must offer to God the sacrifice of our entire civilization. Not only will we die, we will erase every memory that we ever existed. When the moon reaches its lowest point on the 30th of September, all our blood will return to the earth that gave us life. The children we left behind will be found by others and raised without knowledge of us. Thus, the sin of resisting the divine shall be erased from creation. Diego realized he was witnessing the ultimate result of 11 years of psychological experimentation. They had created a mental contagion so powerful it had convinced entire populations to commit voluntary genocide, not only against themselves, but against their own history. At dawn on September 30th, 1559, precisely at 4:47 a.m., according to Diego's records, the 4,300 people executed what became the largest collective suicide in the history of New Spain. Yet even this outcome defied expectation. Instead of using weapons or violence, the entire population ingested a mixture of local herbs that induced a deep sleep from which none would awaken. From his vantage point on the ridge, Diego watched as 4,300 people laid down simultaneously within the perfect geometric pattern, closed their eyes at the same instant, and quietly stopped breathing over the course of an hour. When the colonial authorities arrived 3 weeks later, they found a mystery no investigation would ever solve. The bodies were perfectly preserved and arranged, as if an entire society had transformed itself into a macabre work of art. There were no signs of violence, disease, or coercion. Even more disturbing, the official inquiry found that the 7 original communities had been completely erased, all buildings demolished, fields burned, every written record destroyed. It was as if 4,300 people had decided to eliminate every trace of their civilization. But Diego's most horrifying discovery came when he analyzed the geometric layout of the corpses. Using his knowledge of mathematics and geometry, he realized that the pattern of bodies formed a precise diagram of the psychological manipulation techniques his family had spent 12 years developing. As if, in their final moments, the victims had mapped the very process that led them to self-destruction. Diego returned to the convent of Oaxaca in a state of psychological collapse that terrified his father and brother. For weeks he refused to speak of what he had witnessed, writing compulsively in increasingly complex ciphers that neither Antonio nor Bartolome could decode. Then, one November night in 1559, Diego confronted his family with an accusation that changed everything. "We have created something that goes beyond human manipulation," he said. "The techniques we developed have taken on a life of their own. The contagion no longer needs us to spread." To prove it, he presented evidence gathered in secret. In at least 15 communities that had never had direct contact with the experiment victims, new leaders were emerging who experienced identical divine visions, the very ones Bartolome had once induced artificially. "The phenomenon is spreading on its own," Diego said, trembling between horror and fascination. "It is like a disease, but one that infects thought instead of flesh. We have discovered something the authorities must never learn of." Confronted at last with the full consequences of their experiments, Antonio Montesinos made a decision that would seal the fate of his family. Instead of ending their work, he chose to accelerate it, determined to understand and control the phenomenon before it escaped their influence entirely. "If we have opened this door," he declared, "then it must be us who closes it." The final 5 years of the Montesinos operation, between 1589 and 1594, marked a descent into absolute horror, surpassing even their previous atrocities. Convinced they had uncovered fundamental forces of the human psyche that could be harnessed, the three family members plunged into an abyss of experimentation that bordered on madness. Antonio developed what he called the self-containment protocol, a method designed to create psychologically manipulated victims who would be immune to the contagion they themselves carried. His theory was that if they could produce subjects aware of their own conditioning, they could act as firebreaks to halt the spread. Bartolomé, meanwhile, began experimenting with recursive theological manipulation, techniques that not only altered victims' beliefs, but transformed them into unconscious manipulators of others. He created sermons laced with hypnotic elements so subtle that anyone who listened to them in full would become capable of reproducing the same effects on new listeners, without realizing it. But it was Diego who made the most terrifying discovery of all. While analyzing the contagion's propagation patterns, he realized that he himself had begun to experience some of the very symptoms he was documenting in others. His dreams had become unusually vivid, following narrative structures identical to the psychological scripts his brother used on test subjects. "I believe we have been exposed to the phenomenon for too long," he wrote in his private diary in March 1591. "We ourselves have been infected. The only difference is that we understand the mechanisms, which allows us to resist the more destructive effects. But I am no longer certain how long that resistance can hold." Paranoia began to consume the family. Each member started to suspect the others had been compromised by their own experiments. Family meetings turned into psychological interrogations, each trying to detect signs of subconscious manipulation in the others. The situation reached its breaking point in the summer of 1593, when Diego discovered that Bartolomé had been using subtle manipulative techniques on him and their father for years. The progress reports Bartolomé presented at their family meetings, Diego realized, contained hidden hypnotic triggers designed to make Antonio and Diego accept increasingly extreme levels of experimentation without question. "My own brother has been manipulating me for 5 years," Diego wrote in coded entries so complex they required multiple keys to decipher. "I can no longer trust any of my memories or decisions since 1588. It is possible that our entire escalation into greater horrors was the result of his unconscious influence." The confrontation that followed exposed an even more horrifying truth. When Antonio accused Bartolomé of the manipulation, his eldest son calmly admitted it, but insisted he had not done it consciously. "These techniques have become part of my natural way of speaking," Bartolomé explained with chilling serenity. "Whenever I talk to anyone, I automatically use patterns of tone and language that induce suggestibility. It's not a choice. It's something I can no longer stop." Antonio realized, then, that his family had created something that had consumed them entirely. They had developed manipulation techniques so powerful they had lost the ability to communicate normally, even with one another. Then came the final revelation, the one that pushed Antonio beyond despair. In December 1593, while reviewing 12 years of experiment records, he discovered mathematical patterns showing that the psychological contagion was spreading along predictable routes that would eventually reach the major cities of New Spain. His calculations suggested that if the phenomenon continued at its current rate, by 1610 it would infect significant urban populations, including Mexico Tenochtitlan. The consequences of a voluntary self-destruction contagion in a city of 100,000 souls would be catastrophic, not just for New Spain, but for the entire Spanish Empire. "We have created a plague that does not touch the body, but the soul," Antonio wrote in his final diary. "If we do not act immediately, our experiments could annihilate Western civilization in the Americas." Faced with this realization, Antonio made the most drastic decision of his life. In the early morning of January 15th, 1594, he sent encrypted letters to specific authorities within the Holy Office, the Viceroyalty, and the Ecclesiastical Council of Mexico, revealing partial information about the family's experiments and requesting immediate intervention to contain a theological threat of continental magnitude. The letters were carefully crafted to present the Montesinos not as the creators of the danger, but as researchers who had merely discovered it. Antonio described the psychological contagion as a natural demonic phenomenon they had detected while studying indigenous resistance, and their manipulation techniques as necessary spiritual countermeasures against it. The response was swift and devastating. On January 23, 1594, combined forces of the Holy Office and the Viceroyal Army surrounded the convent of Oaxaca. But what they found inside was something no one had anticipated. The 3 members of the Montesinos family were still alive, but in a condition the official investigators described as collective demonic possession. When the investigators entered the convent, they found Antonio, Bartolomé, and Diego alive, but their minds seemed erased. All 3 had performed upon themselves an extreme version of their own psychological manipulation techniques, inducing selective amnesia that had wiped every memory related to their experiments. When questioned, they spoke as ordinary scholars, calm, articulate, and coherent, with no knowledge of psychological conditioning, indigenous experiments, or mental contagion. Their answers were so consistent and convincing that it was clear every trace of 12 years of work had been systematically purged from their minds. Even more unsettling was what the investigation revealed afterward. The family had meticulously destroyed all physical evidence of their experiments. The only documents remaining were the official reports of the indigenous rebellions they themselves had caused, all written as if they were spontaneous uprisings with no connection between them. The case of the Montesinos family showed just how far human knowledge could turn against itself when stripped of ethical restraint. What do you think? Did the Montesinos truly erase their own memories? Or was something even darker behind their convenient amnesia? If you're one of those few investigators unafraid to face the darkest truths of history, subscribe, activate the bell, and share this story with someone who appreciates the mysteries others prefer to keep buried. The colonial authorities classified all information related to the Montesinos case as a permanent state secret. The 3 family members were quietly transferred to separate monasteries in Spain, where they lived out the rest of their lives as ordinary monks, never again permitted to teach or preach. Officially, the School of Preachers of Oaxaca was closed due to minor administrative irregularities. The convent itself was completely demolished and the land converted into a cemetery for epidemic victims, ensuring that no one would ever dare to build or dig there again. But the most extreme measures were taken not against the family, but against the communities that had been touched by the psychological contagion. Between 1594 and 1598, special teams from the Holy Office visited more than 40 towns across Oaxaca, Puebla, and neighboring regions, conducting what were officially called mass community exorcisms. In reality, as later documents revealed, these teams were systematically destroying every object, structure, or record that could preserve the cultural memory of anything connected to the Montesinos experiments. Rodrigo Vasquez, the observer who had documented much of the experimentation, was found dead in his home in Puebla in March 1595. Officially, he had died of a sudden fever. Later investigations showed his notes and documents had been burned, and his body bore symptoms consistent with mercury poisoning. By the early 1600s, every direct trace of the experiments had been either erased or locked away in archives that would remain sealed for centuries. The only surviving references appeared as scattered annotations in administrative records, vague mentions of census irregularities, unexplained disappearances, and discrepancies in indigenous population reports. Yet the effects of the contagion were not entirely erased. For decades after 1594, colonial investigators continued to find isolated cases of collective self-destructive behavior in communities that had no known contact with the original victims. The pattern was always the same: community leaders developing sudden apocalyptic convictions, entire populations accepting collective sacrifice as divine duty, villages vanishing after erasing every trace of their existence. The last officially documented case occurred in 1687, nearly a century after the school's closure. A community of 200 people in the mountains of Guerrero disappeared overnight, leaving behind only a collective note that read, "We have completed the purification that began generations ago. Our sacrifice ensures that the error will not spread further." More than 4 centuries later, the Montesinos case remains one of the best-kept secrets of Spanish colonial history. The few surviving documents in the Archivo General de Indias remain classified with no expiration date, and the rare historians granted access report pages deliberately torn, blacked out, or mutilated. What makes the case so disturbing is not only the horror the Montesinos unleashed, but the possibility that their discoveries about mass psychological manipulation were never truly lost. Some historians have suggested that similar techniques resurfaced across different institutions throughout history, adapted to modern contexts, but built on the same fundamental principles. The question that still haunts researchers is whether the psychological contagion the Montesinos created was truly eradicated or merely went dormant, waiting for the right conditions to return. The patterns of voluntary self-destruction they documented bear uncanny resemblance to modern phenomena, from cult suicides to social movements that seem to drive their followers toward predictable, ruinous ends. Perhaps the most terrifying lesson of the Montesinos story is not that they learned how to manipulate minds, but that they proved entire populations can be convinced to embrace their own annihilation. If that was possible in the 16th century, using primitive theology and rudimentary psychology, what might be possible today with our modern understanding of neuroscience, communication, and mass persuasion? The Montesinos family demonstrated that the greatest horror is not to be destroyed by others, but to be convinced to destroy oneself. And that is a lesson humanity should never completely forget. Even now, on moonless nights in Oaxaca, the oldest locals avoid walking near the cemetery built atop the ruins of the preacher's convent. They say that when the wind blows just right, you can still hear faint echoes of sermons that were never meant to be spoken, words better left ununderstood, and questions of faith that are far safer left unanswered. Did the story of the Montesinos truly end in 1594, or did they simply learn how to hide their methods better? That, perhaps, is a question none of us should ever have to discover the answer to, in the most terrible way possible.